At the beginning of Chapter 1, it was a breezy day outside the church. The nuns watched as one person placed his hands on the magic ball, and it was announced that his suitable profession was soldier. The next person was then called forward. A man stepped ahead. His name was Chris Sparring. One nun quietly recognized him as the twin son of the famous Sparring family and wondered what kind of profession he would receive. Chris looked weary. The ceremony being performed was called the Ritual of Heavenly Grace. In the kingdom of Meldrake, every 16-year-old underwent this ritual to reveal their suitable profession and the skills associated with it. Professions ranged from general combat occupations such as warrior, wizard, and knight to non-combat occupations such as merchant, blacksmith, and farmer. There were also many advanced professions, including mage, holy knight, magic swordsman, and others. Anyone who obtained a high-class profession would receive preferential treatment from the country regardless of their background. The ritual was considered the most important event in a person's life. However, the opposite was also true. Chris' father held greater expectations than anyone for him to obtain the right profession. From an early age, Chris had undergone especially rigorous training as the next head of the family, with the expectation that he would inherit a profession surpassing his father's. Because of that, he absolutely could not afford to be ridiculed during this ritual. Back in the present, Chris stepped forward as the priest held the magic ball and announced that Chris' suitable profession was farmer, with the associated skill poison resistance. Chris' face turned pale. His eyes widened as murmurs spread through the crowd. The young man standing behind him was equally shocked before stepping forward to console and encourage him. Chris glanced at him as Klaus smiled. The priest then called the next person, and Klaus responded before stepping forward. One nun remarked that Klaus was so gentle, while the other commented that the older brother must have been very worried about his profession. Chris' hand trembled. He had worked hard until this very day, yet he could only wonder what it had all been for. Suddenly, everyone gasped as the magic ball shone brilliantly. The crowd whispered that Klaus had obtained the holy sword profession. Others remarked on how astonishing it was, with someone noting that since the first hero, Klaus was believed to be the fifth holy sword. Klaus turned toward the crowd and waved. Back at the Sparring estate, praise surrounded Klaus. Their father declared that this was exactly what he expected from a son of the Sparring family and advised Klaus to become a good leader in the future. Disheartened, Chris tried to call out to his father, but his father only glared at him. After years of teaching and training Chris, his father could not accept that he had become a farmer, and he was even more angered that Chris still wore an expressionless face. Chris apologized, but his father ordered him to leave the house and dismissed him as a useless thing. Throughout the previous day, Chris had been used as the target for sparring practice, fighting with his bare hands while being repeatedly scolded. From a distance, he noticed Klaus. Klaus stopped him as he was leaving and remarked that he was departing without saying anything. Referring to Chris as his brother, Klaus claimed that he had saved the family's reputation on Chris' behalf. Wearing a devilish smirk, he smugly demanded Chris' gratitude. Chris gritted his teeth, unable to understand why Klaus insisted on making fun of him. The two brothers had never spoken to each other before. Since childhood, Klaus had been physically weak and was always accompanied by their mother and a doctor. By the age of 5, he gradually recovered and had lived a normal life ever since. Unlike Chris, who had been subjected to relentless training by their father from an early age, Klaus had never been required to train. It seemed that Klaus disliked Chris so much that no matter how much Chris tried to speak to him, Klaus barely responded. Up until then, the two brothers had never had a proper conversation. Klaus laughed and wondered why Chris still did not understand. Chris remained silent. Klaus clicked his tongue and reflected that, before that day, he had been the one their father abandoned simply because Chris had been born 10 minutes earlier. In his view, someone who had been raised with the care Chris received could never understand. Chris thought that perhaps Klaus had his own thoughts and feelings, but he could not understand why Klaus hated him. If Chris had ever been given a choice, he believed he had been the one who wanted to change their childhood the most. Klaus cackled, believing that God had favored him by bestowing upon him the holy sword. He mocked Chris by bringing up his profession as a farmer. Chris told him to stop, but Klaus drew his sword and pointed it at Chris's forehead, leaving a wound. Klaus warned him not to get angry and questioned whether Chris wanted to be killed on the spot. Chris drew his own sword and the two blades collided. Klaus laughed, mocking Chris for being nothing more than a lowly farmer and questioning whether he truly intended to fight against the holy sword. He declared that he was ready at any time. Before he could continue, however, Chris had already placed his blade against Klaus' neck. Klaus froze in shock. Chris sheathed his sword, thinking that he had endured exceptionally harsh training since childhood. Even if his profession was farmer, this outcome was only natural. As Chris walked away, Klaus called after him, insisting that it was not over yet. Klaus drew his sword again and advanced. Chris regarded the matter as settled and had no interest in someone he considered weak. Holding the holy sword, Klaus declared his intent to kill Chris. Chris looked back as immense power began radiating from Klaus. Klaus unleashed the sacred slash with the intent to kill him. An explosion erupted. Klaus clicked his tongue in annoyance after realizing that Chris had managed to dodge the attack. He muttered that he had used too much strength. Chris' eyes widened. He could not believe that, no matter how hard he had trained in swordsmanship, it seemed meaningless before the greatest profession. It simply did not make sense. At the beginning of Chapter 2, Chris ran into the forest. Klaus chased after him, cursing as he complained that Chris had made a fool of him again. He shouted for Chris to come back, but Chris continued deeper into the forest. Chris made his way through the dense trees, passing countless bushes before slowing to a stop. He looked around, exhaled, and noticed a river. Sitting by the riverbank, he removed his shoes and examined his swollen ankle. Although he had managed to escape, he wondered what he should do next. The memory of Klaus' grin made him uneasy. Klaus had genuinely tried to kill him and would surely do so again if they met. Since someone might still be pursuing him, Chris decided to hide in the forest for the time being. He opened his palm and realized that it was all he had left. If he had not been injured, he could have hunted animals or monsters for food, but in his current condition that was impossible. Limping, he stood and continued forward while carefully observing his surroundings. He had visited the Peisha forest many times to hunt with his father, but he had never ventured this deep before. There was no sign of monsters, let alone animals. Eventually, he found a cave and went inside. It was simple, but at least it provided a place to stay for the time being. After roughly cleaning it, he no longer had to worry about the rain or the wind. For now, all he could do was wait for time to pass. Spotting a bug, Chris considered eating it as a last resort, though he needed to find something to eat. His gaze shifted to the surrounding plant. Since his skill was toxic resistance, he believed he probably would not die no matter what he ate. Although he had never imagined using the skill this way, he was grateful that it was useful now. He bit into a plant. The leaves were slightly sweet, but when he tried the flowers, their intense bitterness made him jolt before immediately vomiting. The taste was unbearable. Looking over the other plants, he found that most offered nothing but bitterness and astringency, leaving him even more exhausted after eating them. Chris continued gathering food, collecting mushrooms, berries, and even pitcher plant. By the time night fell, Ninmenka was the only exception. Among the other plants, the stranger their appearance, the easier they were to eat and the more likely they were to have flavors besides bitterness. The remaining problem was finding drinking water. The only source he discovered was a muddy puddle. Scooping up a handful, he wished he could return to the stream, even if it took several hours. However, because he had not been paying attention while fleeing, he had gone too deep into the forest and could no longer remember the way back. He had become lost. With toxic resistance protecting his body, he knew the water itself would not harm him. Staring at the muddy puddle, he realized that if he refused to drink, dehydration would kill him instead. Closing his eyes, he forced the muddy water into his mouth. It reeked, tasted bitter, and felt completely foreign. He gagged. There was no decent drinking water, and there was no proper food. That night, Chris slept inside the cave. He dreamed of Klaus standing before him with a grin before cutting him in half. Startled awake by the nightmare, he sat up. Morning had arrived. While it rained, Chris improvised a weapon. He also began eating bugs. A few days passed after he entered the Peisha forest. At last, he found meat. Although it came from a corpse, it was the first animal he had discovered. The flesh had already rotted, but after surviving on nothing but plants and insects for several days, it seemed like a delicious meal. Despite the terrible stench that overwhelmed his senses, he believed grilling it with vegetables would make it taste better. He grilled the rotten meat together with rosemary. Taking a bite, he slowly chewed it. It was the worst-tasting meat he had ever eaten, yet to him it was an incredibly delicious dish. It had been a long time since he had eaten until he was full. Although the forest itself was not dangerous, obtaining food was difficult because there were almost no living creatures. Chris did not know whether the herbs mixed into the food he had eaten were responsible, but the wound on his leg had almost completely healed. Believing it was finally time to hunt animals and monsters, he listened carefully, but only the sound of birds chirping filled the forest. Suddenly, he heard rustling nearby. Looking around, he spotted disturbed grass, several footprints, and the faint scent of a beast. Realizing something was approaching, he quickly hid behind a tree. Peering from behind the trunk, he saw a figure walking in the distance and recognized it as an orc. At the beginning of Chapter 3, Chris followed the orc from behind. He had only seen an orc once before. At that time, even his father had found it somewhat difficult to deal with one without using any skills. If this orc was on the same level as the one from back then, its ability was probably comparable to his own. Without skills, his father's physical strength was not much different from his. The only weapon Chris had now was a homemade axe, making a direct fight extremely dangerous. Even so, he wanted to eat meat. Chris attacked the orc from behind and struck its arm. Gritting his teeth, he watched as the orc came to a halt. The orc looked downward, but Chris immediately ran. The orc slammed its club into the ground, but it hit nothing as Chris had already hidden. Fortunately, the orc did not flee. Chris emerged again, dodging each of its attacks. The orc searched for him before smashing the tree behind which Chris had been hiding. Its club became lodged in the trunk, giving Chris an opening. He rushed forward and slashed the orc across its back. His weapon broke on impact. Realizing the situation was bad, Chris prepared himself, but the orc staggered before collapsing onto the ground. It did not move. Chris wondered why it remained motionless and questioned whether he had really killed it with a single blow. It still showed no sign of movement. He convinced himself that the wound must have been so deep that it could no longer move. Swinging his axe again, he struck it, causing blood to spurt. Thanks to his poison-resistant skill, he could still eat the meat even if it rotted. Since he had taken its life, he thought the least he could do was make its organs into something delicious. If there had been a source of clean water, he could have prepared it better, but he had no other choice. Dismantling the orc where it had fallen would make transporting it difficult, so he decided to carry the entire body back to his base first. Chris lifted the gigantic orc, finding it lighter than he had expected. After returning to the cave, he went back outside and looked around. The orc's body was enormous, and simply cutting it into smaller pieces would take a considerable amount of time. Even so, he ended up with a large supply of meat, making the exhausting day worthwhile. He set aside enough meat for that day and the next while planning to dry the rest. Although he wanted to eat some immediately, his entire body reeked of blood. He went to the muddy puddle and carefully washed himself, taking care not to be swept away by the muddy water. Later, he grilled the orc meat. Orcs were humanoid monsters, and many considered eating their meat taboo, but given his circumstances, he could not afford to care. Holding a skewer, he noticed that instead of the smell of rotten meat, it carried the aroma of fresh meat. The only remaining question was the taste. Chris cautiously took a bite. It was unbelievably delicious. The meat was juicy, and a sweet aroma spread through his mouth, feeling as though it reached straight to his brain. It was an exceptionally delicious dish. Afterward, he even ate the portion he had intended to save for the following day. He had planned to try preparing it in different ways, but he abandoned the idea. Lying on the ground afterward, Chris recalled how he had defeated the orc. Orcs possessed thick hair and tough skin, something he knew firsthand after dismantling it himself. Beneath its layer of fat had been muscles as hard as armor. Until now, it would have been impossible for him to inflict a fatal wound on an orc with a single strike. Yet he had crushed its head with nothing more than a wooden weapon and even carried its body back to the cave. He concluded that the ritual's blessing was most likely responsible. He wondered if his physical strength had increased. Even if his blessing had made him a farmer, perhaps its enhancement ability made growing stronger much easier. However, it felt as though his strength had increased far beyond what should have been possible. He questioned whether becoming stronger was a result of being defeated by Klaus. Muscles grew stronger after being broken down and recovering, so perhaps the same phenomenon had happened to him. Even if that were true, he still felt he had become far too strong all at once. Whatever the reason, he was glad that he had managed to defeat the orc so easily on his own. Morning arrived and sunlight streamed into the cave. Chris woke up, trained, cooked some meat, and remained there until nightfall. After eating once more, he packed his belongings and set out. As he traveled, he marked the trees with his knife. A month had passed since he entered the Peisha forest. He had finally finished eating all of the orc meat. In the past, he would certainly have thrown away anything he could not finish, but now he understood the pain of having nothing to eat. Even though it had been a monster, he had killed it for food and could not bring himself to waste any of it. Although he would have been able to live in the Peisha forest for a few more months, all of the orc meat was now gone. Surviving on nothing but the unpleasant plants would be difficult. Believing that things outside might have settled down by now, he decided to leave the forest and head toward a city. His current goal was to survive while training to become stronger. Thinking of his father and Klaus, he resolved to surpass them. Chris continued walking until he reached the stream. There, he washed his clothes and bathed. Emerging from the water, he gasped for air. He was relieved to have found the stream again. Besides the muddy water, he had only been collecting rainwater, and it had been a month since he had last tasted clean water. Simply drinking it filled him with emotion, reminding him of something he had once taken for granted. He returned to his clothes and realized he could not leave the forest wearing them. Instead, he tied the leather bag he had made from the orc's skin around his waist, deciding that it was probably better than being mistaken for an exhibitionist. At the beginning of Chapter 4, Chris continued walking day and night. Eventually, his jaw dropped as he realized he had arrived in Exiled. It was the neighboring city to the royal capital, Meldrake. The city was prosperous and crowded, and it was far enough from the town where he had lived to serve as a good hiding place. Above all, Klaus had likely been summoned to the royal capital after receiving the grace of the Holy Sword. Since Exiled was close to the capital, Chris could easily keep track of Klaus' movements while ensuring his own safety. He decided to use the city as his base. Chris noticed people staring at him and realized how much he stood out in his current clothes. He was relieved that the inspection to enter the city had been carried out according to standard procedure. A thorough inspection would have been dangerous for him. Reaching into his pocket, he considered what to do next. First, he was hungry and wanted to buy food. He also needed to find a place to stay and acquire proper weapons. For all of that, he needed money. He entered the props shop Gold Bone. The receptionist explained that anyone wishing to sell goods would be guided to the appraiser's room. Looking around, Chris saw that it was a large business, making it unlikely that he would be cheated. He intended to sell the items he had taken with him when he ran away from home in exchange for cash. Before he could enter the room, loud shouting came from inside. Chris listened as someone angrily questioned the receptionist for allowing a customer like him to enter, wondering if the receptionist had lost his mind. The man scoffed at the idea that someone dressed like Chris could possibly possess anything valuable enough to sell. Chris quietly decided to leave. He had chosen the wrong shop. He had to admit that it was difficult for people to trust someone dressed the way he was. Unbeknownst to him, a hooded figure watched him from nearby. Later, Chris continued wandering through the city. It was hard to believe that it was still the same place. He could identify what the nearby market stalls sold at a glance, but he had no idea what was being sold inside the tent. Thinking it would be rude to peek inside, he wished they would at least put up signboards. Suddenly, the hooded figure tugged on his elbow. Chris stopped walking and knelt, assuming the person was lost. Instead, the figure pulled out a small ball and threw it at his face. The ball burst on impact, splashing its contents over him. Chris winced and wondered what the girl was doing, but she immediately fled. Checking his bag, Chris realized his belongings had been stolen and cursed under his breath. He immediately gave chase. Looking around, he soon spotted the girl again. She ran swiftly through the street. Chris realized she was extremely skilled at escaping and seemed accustomed to weaving through crowds, but he eventually caught her. Holding on to her, Chris scolded her for taking advantage of other people's kindness to steal. The girl glanced at him and struggled to get free. Chris warned her not to shout or he would punch her. As the hood slipped off, he realized she was not a child as he had first assumed but someone around the same age as himself. The girl became visibly nervous. Chris suddenly felt as though he was the one doing something wrong. He asked why she had stolen his belongings. She remained silent. Noticing that she was covering her mouth, Chris pointed out that he could not understand her if she refused to speak. The girl finally admitted that she was afraid of being beaten if she said anything. Chris responded that he would beat her if she refused to answer. Sobbing, she confessed that there was no special reason. If there had to be one, it was simply to survive. Chris awkwardly told her not to ask him. She explained that surviving was the reason she had become a thief. Chris wondered why she had targeted someone like him instead of a wealthier person. He could not tell whether she was lying or simply foolish. Recognizing her skill, Chris remarked that it could not have been her first time stealing. He asked whether she had parents, and she admitted that she did not. He then asked if she had any accomplices. She hesitated, thought for a moment, forced an awkward laugh, and claimed that she had none. Chris immediately realized she was a terrible liar. Threatening to hand her over to the soldiers if she continued lying, Chris watched as she begged him not to do so. He demanded that she stop lying and tell him the truth. In reality, Chris had no desire to involve the authorities since he wanted to avoid them himself. The girl finally confessed that she did have accomplices. They all lived together in an abandoned building. Chris then asked how many there were. The girl admitted that, including herself, there were 2 people. Chris understood and asked whether the other person living with her also worked as a thief. She replied that he did. Judging from her reaction, Chris believed she was telling the truth. He patted her on the head and asked where the person living with her was and whether they were nearby. Chris concluded that if she could make it back there, she would be safe. Meanwhile, a young man sat inside an old building, wondering why the girl had returned so late. He gradually became worried, fearing that she might have been caught. A short while later, the girl arrived and admitted that she had been caught. The young man immediately cursed and drew his sword. Chris warned that if he attacked, he would not hold back either. The girl quickly told Ralph to lower his weapon. Ralph pointed out that the girl had already been captured anyway and questioned why she had brought Chris there. The girl explained that Chris had threatened to hurt her if she failed to bring him along. Chris observed Ralph carefully. From Ralph's stance, he could tell that he had some knowledge of martial arts and swordsmanship, but his balance was poor. Even if Ralph fought seriously, Chris judged that he would not be a match for him. Ralph asked what Chris wanted, insisting that they had no money if that was his goal. Chris explained that he had only come to warn them that if they tried to steal from him again, he would not show any mercy. Both of them looked puzzled. Ralph asked if that was all. Chris released the girl and decided that simply giving a warning would be a waste. Rather than demanding money, he wanted information in return. Having only recently arrived in Exiled, he admitted that he was unfamiliar with the city. He asked the 2 of them to show him the way back to the central district. Ralph replied that if that was all Chris wanted, then there was no problem. Chris turned to the girl, referring to her as the redhead, and asked if she agreed. She wondered whether she had to help as well. Chris decided that she did, since she had been the one who had stolen from him in the first place. Chris considered information about the city to be extremely valuable since he knew almost nothing about it. He then asked for their names. Ralph immediately refused, declaring that Chris should not even dream of learning them. Chris calmly identified the girl as Hesta and the young man as Ralph. Ralph was startled that their names had been exposed. Chris simply realized that they had already been calling each other by those names. Ralph made it clear that he had no intention of becoming friendly with Chris. Chris readily agreed. Later, the two guided Chris around the city. Eventually, he stopped in front of a shop. Standing by the entrance, Chris acknowledged that the two of them had been a great help and thanked them. At the beginning of Chapter 5, the valuables were placed on the table. The shopkeeper examined them and determined that they were all valuable items. He said he would carefully appraise everything and suggested that Chris browse the shop while he waited. Chris walked over to the weapons section. One of the weapons had a price tag of 5 gold coins. Although every item looked impressive, he realized that his current budget made them impossible to afford. He then moved to the bookshelves and picked up a book titled The Memoirs of Botanist Otto. Chris had never heard of the author, and the title did not seem particularly interesting, yet it somehow caught his attention. If it had been inexpensive, he would have bought it, but the price was 3 gold coins. It was a rare ancient book, making it far too expensive. With such a high price, Chris assumed there had to be something special about it. Hesta asked whether Chris could read the writing. Chris replied that he could, explaining that he had been taught since childhood. He then asked whether Hesta could not read it. She muttered something before falling silent and dismissing the matter. The shopkeeper returned and apologized for keeping them waiting, explaining that the appraisal was complete. He stated that if Chris accepted the offer, he would purchase everything. The earrings were valued at 2 silver coins, the ring at 4 silver coins, and the necklace at 3 gold coins. Chris was stunned by the necklace's appraisal. The shopkeeper explained that although it was small, it contained a sapphire. Ralph was equally shocked upon hearing the price. He approached Chris and remarked that the shopkeeper only offered such prices once every few years. The shopkeeper scolded Ralph for eavesdropping. Ralph then wondered whether Chris actually came from a wealthy family. The shopkeeper reminded Ralph that they were in the middle of a negotiation and told him not to interfere. The shopkeeper then pointed to the pocket watch and appraised it at 1 gold coin. Chris repeated the amount before picking it up. He thought his father's watch was worth less than he had expected, considering how much his father treasured it. After thinking for a moment, he decided to sell everything except the pocket watch. The shopkeeper accepted the decision. After receiving the payment, Chris thanked him, saying that he had been a great help. The shopkeeper explained that because the items were stolen goods, he had to offer prices below their true value, meaning the shop also benefited from the transaction. He assured Chris that there was no need to worry and asked if there was anything else. Chris initially replied that there was not, but then remembered one thing that had caught his attention: the book. The shopkeeper remarked that very few people ever noticed it. It was a book in which he himself had a great interest. Although its author was neither famous nor known for any remarkable achievements, he believed the contents were so exceptional that, in the hands of someone knowledgeable, it surpassed any other literary work. That was why he had priced it so highly. Even so, it had remained unsold for years. Chris admitted that the book greatly intrigued him, but he could not afford it with the money he currently had. He hoped that if it was still available the next time he visited, the shopkeeper would sell it to him. The shopkeeper folded his fingers together and offered to let Chris pay later. He suggested that Chris take the book now and return to pay for it once he had the money. Chris was bewildered. After a brief pause, he asked whether he really could do that. He felt awkward even asking, considering that he had just come to the shop to sell stolen goods. The shopkeeper chuckled and assured Chris that he would not make such an offer to just anyone. Since the book had remained unsold for years, letting Chris take it would not cause any inconvenience. Whenever Chris eventually returned to pay for it, no matter how long it took, selling a book that had otherwise sat on the shelf for years would still be a worthwhile profit. Chris simply looked at the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper added that, in the worst-case scenario, if Chris never returned to pay for the book, he would collect the money from Ralph. Ralph immediately protested, wondering how he could possibly pay for it. The shopkeeper then asked Chris once more whether he intended to buy the book. Chris replied that if Rugens was willing to agree to those terms, he had no reason to refuse the offer. Ralph continued complaining that he would never pay for Chris, repeating the claim several times. After leaving the shop, Chris thanked Ralph and Hesta. Thanks to them, he had earned more money than he had expected. Ralph remarked that Chris had been fortunate, as most people would have to work for months to earn that amount. Remembering something, Chris pointed out that neither of them had eaten at the shop earlier and offered to treat them to a meal. Hesta immediately became excited, while Ralph protested. Ralph pointed out that they had not earned a single coin that day and should at least find something to sell. Hesta reasoned that accepting a meal sounded much better than searching for something to sell now. Ralph admitted that she had a point but questioned why Chris would treat two people who had just tried to steal from him. Chris explained that it was simply his way of thanking them for introducing him to a good shop. Hesta urged Ralph to accept, reminding him that they had no money. Chris reflected that although he did not have much money himself, he had spent the past several months living alone in the forest. Even if Ralph and Hesta were thieves, simply having people to talk to made him feel at ease. The three of them later entered a tavern. The place was filled with people talking, drinking, and eating. Chris, Ralph, and Hesta sat together at a table. As Chris finished plate after plate of food, Ralph and Hesta watched in amazement. Ralph remarked that although everyone was eating the same food, Chris somehow made his meal look much more delicious. Chris reminded them that he had already explained why. During the month he had spent in the forest, he had survived on nothing but orc meat without any seasoning. Ralph reacted with disgust, insisting that Chris should stop talking about eating raw meat. He admitted that surviving alone in the forest for an entire month without carrying any supplies was impressive. Chris explained that during the first few days he had eaten anything he could find to avoid starving. He had even drunk muddy water and consumed whatever was available. Ralph pointed out that eating poisonous plants should have been fatal. Chris replied that there had been no need to worry because of his skill, poison resistance. Ralph was taken aback that Chris spoke so casually about his skill. Chris did not understand the reaction, believing that whether he possessed the skill or not changed very little. Ralph explained that Chris had always seemed unusually easygoing since they first met. He also knew people with poison resistance, but their skill did not make every poison ineffective. Chris clarified that those people merely experienced less stomach pain or fewer side effects. Ralph questioned whether that was really the case, recalling that such people were usually only slightly better at handling alcohol. Chris explained that he had eaten every suspicious plant he came across, yet nothing had happened to him. Hesta suddenly realized that this must have been why her aloe ball had failed to affect Chris. Chris asked whether she meant the red ball that had flown straight into his eyes. Ralph stared at him in disbelief, explaining that the aloe ball contained a powerful anesthetic capable of leaving someone unable to move for an entire day. Chris was surprised that they used such dangerous items. Ralph concluded that if even the aloe ball had no effect on Chris, then his skill could no longer be considered mere poison resistance. It was probably poison nullification. Chris thought that, regardless of its true nature, it was not a skill he expected to use often. By the time night fell, the three of them were walking through the city together. Ralph asked what Chris planned to do next. Chris replied that he intended to become an adventurer. Since he knew some swordsmanship, he believed he could at least earn enough money to survive each day. Ralph reflected on the idea, remarking that wanderers usually ended up becoming either adventurers or criminals. Chris then asked about Ralph and Hesta, wondering whether they intended to keep surviving through theft forever. The two lowered their heads in silence. Ralph admitted that it had been his plan because they lacked the strength to become adventurers. In his eyes, their hands had already been stained. Chris remarked that it might have been harsh to say, but if someone other than him had caught Ralph and Hesta, they would already be in prison. He believed the two of them should find another way to live. The following day, Chris visited the Adventurers Guild. The building was crowded with adventurers. At the reception desk, he was informed that the registration fee to become an adventurer was 1 silver coin. Chris agreed, paid the fee, and placed the coin on the counter. The receptionist explained that his personal information would be registered using magic and asked him to state his name and age. Chris was about to give his full name but decided against it, saying that simply Chris would be enough. He then stated that he was 16 years old. The magic ball on the counter glowed. The receptionist handed him a guild card and informed him that his registration was complete. From then on, he would be able to accept quests and conduct buying and selling through the guild. The card would record information related to his completed quests and his guild rank, and it could also serve as identification. She advised him to be careful not to lose it before asking whether he had any further questions. Chris did. He first asked whether he could accept any quest he wanted. The receptionist explained that he could not. As a new adventurer, he could only accept beginner-level quests. As his quest completion rate improved, his adventurer rank would rise, allowing him to take on more difficult assignments. Chris then asked about the ranking system. The receptionist explained that it began with Rookie, followed by Bronze, Silver, Gold, Platinum, Mithril, and Diamond. Beyond those were Orichalcum and Hyricane, though there were very few adventurers who reached those ranks, so she doubted Chris would need to concern himself with them. Chris next asked about the abilities required for each rank. The receptionist replied that advancement largely depended on a person's profession and appropriate skills. Quest completion rate and the number of completed quests also played important roles, making it difficult to give an exact standard. Even so, the generally accepted benchmark was that rookies possessed overall abilities of 10, bronze adventurers 20, and silver adventurers 40, with people commonly saying that the required ability roughly doubled with each rank. Chris thanked her for the explanation before asking another question. The receptionist answered it. He asked another, and she explained that as well. After several more questions, she finally asked whether he had anything else to ask. Chris replied that he was satisfied for the time being. The receptionist found it hard to believe he had finally run out of questions, then wished him luck in his career as an adventurer. Chris thanked her and left. Later, Chris entered the forest. Before long, he spotted a goblin and concealed himself in the tall grass. The extermination quest paid 2 copper coins for each goblin, and the left ear had to be brought back as proof. Remembering how his fight with the orc had gone, Chris resolved not to make the same mistake again. This time, he would ensure that his decisive strike landed cleanly. Sneaking up behind the goblin, he swung his sword and split it cleanly in half. Chris' eyes widened as the goblin collapsed to the ground. Something about it felt strange. During his battle with the orc, he had sensed something different. Now, even with a proper sword, cutting a goblin in half had felt absurdly effortless. He did not understand why, but it seemed that he had somehow gained an extraordinary power. At the beginning of Chapter 6, after becoming an adventurer, Chris spent the next 2 months hunting nothing but goblins. As the sun rose that morning, Chris yawned. Ever since arriving in the city, his daily life had remained mostly unchanged, except for one thing. Hesta greeted him with breakfast already prepared, while Ralph announced that they were heading out and asked Chris to lock the door after them. Chris agreed and thanked Ralph. Chris reflected that he was now living together with the 2 former thieves. About a month earlier, after being caught by him, Hesta and Ralph had apparently concluded that they had reached their limit as thieves and came to ask if they could stay with him. Since there were inexpensive hostels where 3 people could share a room and Chris also wanted to keep his expenses low, he accepted. By then, both of them had become adventurers as well. None of them had trouble securing food, clothing, or shelter anymore, and together they had even managed to save 3 gold coins. The previous day, Chris had been promoted from rookie to bronze rank as an adventurer. To verify a hypothesis, he decided to visit the Peisha forest the following day. The memoirs of botanist Otto recorded the discovery of useful properties found in newly discovered plant species mentioned in legends. The book clearly documented place names and titles while explaining botanical knowledge in a simple yet fascinating manner. The section that interested Chris the most was the notes concerning unknown poisonous plants with incurable toxins. Some possessed extremely potent toxic effects that had yet to be fully understood. Among the plants Chris had eaten while surviving in the forest, one was described as having the ability to enhance the body. If that was true, then perhaps he could become even stronger. That day, Chris visited the church. Many people had gathered there. He had heard that the church could record a person's status on an adventurer's card. Before and after eating the plants, he wanted to verify any changes in his abilities. Since he could not measure them himself and checking for changes cost 1 gold coin, he approached a priest. The priest asked how he could help. Chris requested that his abilities be examined. Seeing that Chris was an adventurer, the priest directed him to wait in the next room. Chris thanked him. Inside the next room was the magic ball. Chris thought that if he had been able to use it himself, he would not have needed to spend 1 gold coin. A short while later, the priest entered and apologized for the wait. He introduced himself as Graham, a parish priest of the church. Chris thanked him for the warm welcome. Graham jokingly remarked that if Chris had come to confess, he did not have time that day. Chris explained that he only wanted to have his abilities checked. Graham replied that this would not be a problem. In exchange for 1 gold coin, he asked to borrow Chris' adventurer's card. The magic ball glowed, and after the examination Graham returned the card. Explaining that he had a holy ceremony to attend, Graham excused himself. Chris thanked him. Examining the card, Chris found that he had no normal skills. His special skill had changed to poison nullification. His profession remained farmer, while his attributes showed physical strength +6, muscle strength +8, and endurance +2. Chris had hoped the numbers would be much higher after defeating orcs and goblins. Instead, most of his abilities were still only single-digit. He realized that he was still far from reaching the standard rookie level. Although the card did not display his level of swordsmanship, the numbers accurately reflected his current physical abilities. Chris's attention was drawn to the values shown in parentheses. If his assumption was correct, those numbers represented the increases added to his original abilities after eating the strange plant. His special skill was now listed as poison nullification rather than poison resistance. Chris wondered whether the old parish priest had misspoken during the ritual. After packing his belongings, Chris slung his bag over his shoulder. As he reached the door, Hesta woke up. Sitting upright, she asked where he was going. Chris apologized for waking her. Hesta assured him that it was fine. Chris explained that he had some business to take care of and would not be back for a while. He asked her to inform Ralph on his behalf, adding that he had already paid the rent for the duration of his absence, so there was nothing to worry about. Hesta nodded and said she would let the still-sleeping Ralph know. Chris left the city. Before long, the mountains came into view as he entered the dense forest. Looking around, he recalled that leaving the forest before had been a valuable experience. Without proper food or clean water, he would have died long ago if not for poison nullification. He returned to the cave. Seeing the lone bug still there, he realized it had not reproduced. After arranging his bed, he went outside to gather plants before returning to rest and record his observations. During the previous 2 months, Chris had gathered information from equipment shops, pharmacies, and healing guild. With the knowledge he had acquired, he realized that even the edible and medicinal plants sold in Realzad could be found in the forest. This time, however, he intended to collect only known plant species for verification. If he could remember exactly what he had eaten while surviving before, it would save a great deal of time, but back then he had been focused solely on staying alive. The only thing he clearly remembered was the taste of a certain mushroom. He grilled the mushroom before eating it. It was not particularly bad at first, but he soon covered his nose as a sour aftertaste lingered in his mouth and his tongue became dry. The flavor was disgusting, though still preferable to the intensely bitter plants. Next, he sampled the pitcher plant. Soon after, he became dizzy and felt nauseous. Remembering their sour, rotten taste, he concluded that the insect-eating plant likely still contained insects that had not been fully digested. He decided that it truly was not suitable for consumption. This time, Chris intended to collect 30 species of poisonous plants. Refusing to give up, he continued gathering them, repeatedly venturing deeper into the forest in search of more. After examining the growing collection, he successfully gathered 30 poisonous plant species within a week. Before returning to the Peisha forest, Chris had been worried, but he discovered once again that there were no magical beasts deep within it. The forest was peaceful and easy to live in. He thought that next time he would be able to stay there more comfortably, almost like taking a vacation, although he would still have to endure those terrible plants at every meal. Afterward, Chris returned to the church with his bag. Graham received him once again and recognized him as the adventurer who had recently come to have his abilities examined. Chris confirmed that it was him and apologized to Brother Graham once more. Graham pointed out that only a few days had passed, so he did not expect Chris' abilities to have changed. Chris replied that it was not a problem. Graham answered that if Chris wished to proceed, he had no objection. Graham used the magic ball before returning Chris' adventurer's card. Chris thanked him and immediately examined it. He thought that if his abilities had not increased, then gathering all of those plants would have been a complete waste. There were no changes to his normal or special skills. The only differences were the additional values for physical strength, muscle strength, and endurance. Chris was shocked to discover that the bonus values for physical strength and endurance had each increased by 1. This confirmed that among the plants he had collected in the forest, some possessed the ability to enhance one's abilities. Simply identifying which plants could strengthen a person left Chris speechless as he stared at his adventurer's card. In his mind, the method no longer mattered. As long as it gave him more strength, he was willing to do whatever it took. At the beginning of Chapter 7, as Chris returned home, Ralph confronted him and demanded to know why he had disappeared for an entire week without saying anything. Chris reminded him that he had asked Hesta to pass the message along. Ralph admitted that Hesta had told him, but insisted that Chris should have informed him personally. Chris pushed Ralph's face aside. Ralph asked once again where Chris had gone before suddenly wondering if Chris was planning to leave the lodge. Chris told him to calm down, explaining that he had never said such a thing as he put a skewer of grilled meat into Ralph's mouth. He then handed Hesta her portion. Hesta thanked him, and Chris told her she was welcome. He added that once the two of them became successful adventurers, they should return the favor someday. Ralph again asked where Chris had been. Realizing that Ralph would not stop asking otherwise, Chris explained that he had mentioned before that he once hid in the forest. This time, he had returned there for a week because something had been bothering him. Ralph asked what it was about. Instead of answering, Chris asked how their work as adventurers had been going. The two immediately looked dejected. Ralph admitted that they were completely useless. They could only hunt 5 goblins a day, earning 1 silver coin. Rent cost 4 silver coins, while food cost another 6 silver coins. They barely managed to survive from one day to the next, and if either of them were injured and unable to hunt 5 goblins a day, the situation would become even worse. Chris remarked that it did not sound easy and encouraged them to keep trying. Ralph clenched his fist, intending to make a suggestion, but Chris rejected it before he could speak. Ralph complained that he had not even finished talking. He had wanted to suggest that they form a party together. Chris replied that this was exactly why he had refused. He did not have enough spare money to support such an arrangement. Ralph accused Chris of lying, pointing out that Chris had gone an entire week without working, was still doing fine, and had even bought grilled meat for both of them. To Ralph, that meant Chris clearly had money to spare. Hesta quietly called out to Ralph. Chris glared at him, explaining that everything he could afford now was the result of his own hard work. If treating Ralph and Hesta to food only led to complaints like this, then Ralph should return it. Realizing his mistake, Ralph apologized. Chris understood Ralph's feelings, but he also knew he did not have enough spare money to help anyone else. Even so, if there was some value in working together, he would consider it. He then asked what their compatible professions and skills were. Hesta glanced at Ralph. Ralph questioned why anyone would reveal their own weaknesses to others, insisting that they only had ordinary professions. Chris reminded him that he had already shared his own profession with them, so there was no need to be so cautious. If he had wanted to kill them, he would have done so long ago. Hesta admitted that her compatible profession was wizard and that her skill was magic healing. She decided it was fine because it was Chris. Chris reflected that wizard was one of the combat professions, yet it was also the most unusual among them. It was regarded as the most unconventional profession because manipulating magical power was extremely difficult. Learning magic required either studying at a magic academy or teaching oneself from magic grimoires. Admission to a magic academy was generally limited to the highest-ranking nobles or those who had received the highest-level magic professions during the blessing ceremony. As for magic grimoires, they required knowledge of ancient script to read, and the few sold outside were prohibitively expensive. Chris commented that wizard was still better than his own farmer profession, though Hesta had been unfortunate nonetheless. Hesta agreed. She believed the profession had great potential and genuinely wanted to become a wizard. That was why she had turned to stealing, to earn enough money to buy a magic grimoire. Chris remembered that when they had been at the shop, Hesta had asked whether he could read while he was looking at the book. Hesta was surprised that he still remembered their first meeting. Chris explained that he had simply been curious. After hesitating, Hesta admitted that she had a request. If she ever managed to obtain a magic grimoire, she wanted Chris to teach her how to read it. Chris thought that once a wizard learned magic, the profession would not be inferior to the higher-ranking combat professions. Hesta's future could change because of it. He agreed to her request. Hesta smiled happily and thanked him. Chris then asked about Ralph's profession. Ralph stubbornly refused to tell him. Hesta immediately revealed that Ralph's compatible profession was Holy Knight and that his skills were Divine Strike, Divine Guardian, and Breath of the Protector. Ralph cried out in frustration, scolding Hesta for blurting everything out. Chris quietly reflected on the fact that Ralph was a Holy Knight. Holy Knight was a high-ranking combat profession. Those who possessed it could join the Royal Guards. It ranked among the highest professions that allowed someone to become an adventurer without first serving as a close-quarters guard. Hesta explained that she understood what Chris meant, but Ralph had been seriously injured when he was little. He had injured his knee at the time, and the lingering pain still prevented him from moving properly. Chris recalled that Ralph's dagger-throwing motion had been smooth, yet his balance had been unusually poor. He realized it had all been because of Ralph's knee. Ralph cursed, complaining that Hesta had exposed everything. Chris remarked that Hesta and Ralph were probably the only combat-oriented party that struggled against goblins. Ralph reasoned that they had simply been plagued by bad luck and admitted that he had accepted his misfortune long ago. Chris asked whether everything would be fine if Ralph's knee recovered. Ralph answered that it would not. Ever since he was a child, every village doctor had told him the injury could never be completely healed. Chris questioned why Ralph had given up simply because village doctors had said so. Ralph gritted his teeth before slamming his hand onto the table. He insisted that he had not given up at first. He had searched for other doctors, but none of them had been able to cure his injury. Chris pointed out that all of this had happened when Ralph was still a child. As an abandoned child with neither money nor status, Ralph had done everything he could without achieving any results. Chris could not say for certain, but he believed it would not be long. Before Hesta could speak, Chris stated that both Hesta and Ralph still had potential. He decided that he would form a party with them. The two reacted differently. Chris found it ironic that someone like him, who had been abandoned by his own family because of the results of the blessing ceremony, was now making decisions based on those very same results. Even so, he admitted that he had no intention of teaming up with them as they were now. Ralph asked what he meant. Chris reminded him that he still had things he needed to accomplish first. Once both Ralph and Hesta had become skilled enough to hunt goblins with ease, they could form a party together. Ralph immediately objected, pointing out that the entire reason he had proposed forming a party was because they could not hunt goblins properly. Waiting until they no longer needed help completely defeated the purpose. Hesta, however, understood Chris's reasoning. Her expression became determined. Ralph reacted once more to Hesta's response, but Chris declared that the matter was settled. Ralph continued protesting to Hesta. The following day, Chris visited the Adventurers Guild to accept a quest. The receptionist informed him that, having reached bronze rank, he could now accept bronze-ranked quests and asked whether he wanted to try one. Chris asked what kinds of bronze-ranked quests were available. The receptionist explained that there were many different types of bronze-level quests, which were further classified according to their objective. She asked whether he preferred quests involving a large number of exterminations or only a few. Chris replied that he only wanted a quest requiring a small number of target. The receptionist searched through the available requests before presenting 4 of them. One involved exterminating lost cattle bird. Another required exterminating baby lizard. The third involved eliminating bubble wisps that appeared in the abandoned village to the east. The final quest required exterminating hedgerow slimes that appeared in the lower reaches of the Mithria River. For each of those quests, defeating even a single target was sufficient. Chris asked why some quests specified a location while others did not. The receptionist explained that quests without designated locations came from clients who wanted materials from specific monsters. To complete those requests, adventurers only needed to find the monsters, defeat them, and bring back either their entire bodies or the specified body parts. Chris understood and concluded that the quests with designated locations were intended to eliminate monsters causing trouble in a particular area. The receptionist confirmed that this was correct. She further explained that quests without designated locations required gathering information about the monsters, tracking them down, defeating them, and returning with the requested materials. Although these quests required more time and effort, they often offered higher rewards. Chris asked which of the available quests paid the most. The receptionist answered that the lost cattle bird extermination offered the highest reward. It had been requested by a meat processing shop, and the entire body of the monster had to be brought back. The base reward was 1 gold coin, but depending on the bird's condition and size, the payment could reach as much as 3 gold coins. Chris was surprised by the reward and then asked which quest paid the least. The receptionist replied that both the hedgerow slime and bubble wisp extermination quests paid 4 silver coins. Chris reflected that even the lowest-paying bronze-ranked quest offered a reward equivalent to defeating 20 goblins. Bronze-level quests clearly provided much greater rewards when judged by their payout alone. Although accepting the lost cattle bird quest seemed like the best choice, he suspected there had to be a reason for its unusually high reward. If it took too long to complete, there was always the risk of running out of money before finishing it. With that in mind, he began considering which quest he should choose. At the beginning of Chapter 8, Chris went to the location. There were many bugs, and the area resembled a forest. He passed through the trees and walked forward before spotting a creature ahead. It was a hedgerow slime. He covered his mouth at the disgusting sight. He had chosen this mission because he believed it would be easier, but he might have been wrong. Even if he managed to defeat it skillfully, his weapons and equipment would still be tainted by its stench and might need to be discarded. Although he wanted to give up, the amount of money he currently had left him with no choice but to push through. The creature was as tall as he was. The dark spot within its body was its core. He could not be careless because he did not know which side was its front. Chris hid behind a tree before dashing toward the slime, intending to finish it with a single decisive strike. He struck its core, but it immediately released spikes. As he dodged them, he realized with frustration that one strike was not enough to defeat it. He lunged into the air once more and swung his sword. He struck forward and shattered its core. The slime exploded, and its foul juices clung to his sword. He vowed never to accept this mission again. From his failure in choosing the hedgerow slime as his target, Chris learned a lesson. A month passed without him encountering any difficulties while completing bronze-ranked missions. His afternoons were spent completing mission reports and preparing for the next day. His remaining time was devoted to practicing swordsmanship and acquiring knowledge about plants at the Healing Guild and Herb Shop. Every day, he earned at least 4 silver coins and eventually managed to save 20 gold coins. Even though he had worked without rest for an entire month, he had never imagined he could earn that much. He returned to Rugens, who greeted him. Rugens asked whether he had come to look at the weapons again. Since then, Chris had visited Shichifuka many times. Chris explained that he had come to pay for the book and apologized for making Rugens wait. Rugens asked whether Chris had enough money now and remarked that he could simply pay whatever amount he could afford in advance. Chris assured him that he had enough money to pay in full and that there was no need to worry. Chris reflected that if he had not possessed the book Memoirs of the Botanist Otto back then, he probably would not have realized the potential of those poisonous plants. He felt extremely grateful to Rugens for selling the book to him. Rugens accepted the payment and thanked Chris. Chris believed he should be the one expressing gratitude because the book had been truly useful, and he thanked Rugens. He also had something he wanted to ask. Rugens asked what it was. Chris asked whether the shop sold necromancy scrolls. Rugens repeated the term before standing up and walking to the cabinet. He opened one of the drawers and took something out, explaining that although it was old, it was indeed a necromancy scroll. Chris asked which necromancy scroll it was. Rugens explained that Hesta had specifically asked him to keep it and not sell it, so he had left it there. Chris wondered why Rugens had not suggested that Hesta pay later. Rujins explained that the pay-later arrangement had only been offered because it was Chris. If he handed it to Hesta first, she would simply run away. Chris thought that the two of them had known each other for a long time, but it seemed there was not much trust between them. Rujins considered that to be precisely because they had known each other for so long before asking whether Chris intended to buy the scroll. Chris asked how much it cost. Rujins stated that he would sell it for 2 platinum coins. Chris was shocked. In his mind, 1 platinum coin was equal to 10 gold coins. He had never expected it to be that expensive and thought the price was steep. Rujins told Chris that he had spent an entire day deciding whether he should buy the scroll or not. In the end, he still had not sold it, and no one who came to those alleys to shop was foolish enough to buy something so expensive. Because of its price, he admitted he should have asked for an advance payment, but since it was Chris, he was willing to let him pay the full amount later. Chris was once again shocked but remained hesitant. He thought about how the purpose of the necromancy scroll was for Hesta to learn magic. Since she could not use magic at the moment, there was no hope for her. However, if she learned even a little magic, she would definitely become a valuable asset. Joining forces with them would also benefit him, but he could not burden himself with debt solely because of Hesta. Appreciating Rujins' generosity, Chris declined the offer for the time being. Rujins considered it a shame but assured him that if he ever decided to buy it, he only needed to return and find him. Chris thanked him. Later, Chris checked the plants he had collected. Since he had some spare money, he planned to visit the church to check whether his status had changed. During his previous trip to the forest, he had gathered several poisonous plants, dried them, and eaten half of them. He bought 1 leaf. The more poisonous plants he consumed, however, the more bitter they became. He felt that he needed to study better ways to eat them. During the previous check, both his endurance and muscle strength had increased by 1. If both increased by another point this time, he could conclude that the remaining poisonous plants would not further enhance his abilities. However, it would be troublesome if only 1 attribute increased, leaving him hoping that luck would not turn against him. After entering the church, Graham noticed Chris. Chris thought that if the church did not know what he was doing, they would probably assume he came only to throw money at them. He greeted Graham and apologized for troubling him again. Graham asked whether he wanted another ability check, noting that it had not been long since the previous one. Chris replied that even if his abilities had not changed, he would not complain. Graham accepted this and led him to the room. When the examination was finished, Graham returned Chris's card and remarked that even if his abilities had not changed, he was certain Chris's determination had not been in vain, expressing the hope that Chris understood that. Chris narrowed his eyes and replied that he already knew and that Graham did not need to repeat the same thing over and over again. Graham looked away, apologized for being persistent, and excused himself. After checking his card, Chris found that the only changes were increases to his endurance, muscle strength, and stamina. This time, both endurance and muscle strength had increased by 1 on the left side, while there was no change on the right side. He concluded that the increase was most likely the result of his own efforts after a month of hunting demons. He wondered how many demons he had hunted over the course of that month for his abilities to increase by only as much as they had from eating poisonous plants. On the other hand, those poisonous plants possessed the hidden ability to make him stronger. Among the poisonous plants he had eaten this time, however, there had been no type capable of enhancing his abilities. What concerned him most was the possibility that drying them had rendered them ineffective. He decided that he would eat the remaining 15 types and check his status again to make sure. As he walked back home, Chris became puzzled when he reached the door. Hesta and Ralph were kneeling in front of him. Chris froze and asked what they were doing. Hesta was about to answer, but Ralph stopped her from speaking. Hesta then called out to Chris and explained that they had become strong enough to defeat goblins with ease. She asked him to join their party. Chris had already noticed that they used to return home completely exhausted, but lately they had been spending their time relaxing instead. He had thought the moment would come eventually, although it had arrived much sooner than he expected. Chris agreed and decided that he would accompany them the following day to see how they performed. Hesta thanked him and insisted that Ralph do the same. Ralph reluctantly thanked Chris. Chris thought that if they truly could defeat goblins so easily, forming a party with them would be beneficial. He handed them some grilled skewers, explaining that he had bought them and wanted them to try them. Ralph was delighted to see the grilled skewers again, while Hesta thanked Chris. That night, Chris crossed out another entry on his list. The poisonous herbs he had eaten that day had not enhanced his abilities, so he decided to disregard those remaining 15 types of plants in the future. Although it had cost money and required considerable effort to prepare them, he did not consider it too much trouble when it came to becoming stronger. A short while later, Ralph approached him and asked about the pile of dried grass. Chris explained that it was probably fatal. Ralph was shocked and wondered why Chris had brought something like that home. Chris told him that it would be fine as long as he did not eat it. Ralph asked whether Chris had brought the leaves home to sell and whether that was why he had extra money. Chris explained that it was not what Ralph thought. The dried leaves were for him to eat, reminding Ralph that he had already mentioned his poison nullification skill. Ralph could not understand why someone with such a skill would intentionally eat poisonous dried grass, and wondered if it was really that delicious. Chris admitted that it tasted terrible. Silence followed. At the beginning of Chapter 9, they were in the forest. Hesta was panting, and Ralph was gasping for air. Chris looked back at them. Ralph wondered why they had left so early and questioned whether it was because of his leg, believing that he was the one slowing everyone down. Chris crouched in front of him and told Ralph to climb onto his back. Ralph was shocked and insisted that he was fine and could walk on his own. Chris replied that Ralph was too slow and warned that if he was unwilling to work as a team, he would cancel the plan to form a party. Ralph shivered as Hesta stared at him. Later, Chris set Ralph back down. He told Hesta and Ralph to show him how easily they could hunt goblins. The two agreed. Hesta told Ralph that they would do it the same way they always did, and Ralph agreed, telling her to leave it to him. They walked forward together until they heard something rustling. Hesta signaled everyone to stop and pointed at a goblin. She followed it before suddenly dashing forward and striking it from behind. The goblin merely touched its head, turned toward Hesta, and smirked. Hesta ran, and the goblin chased after her. Ralph suddenly appeared, aimed at the goblin, and stabbed it, killing it. Hesta asked Chris what he thought, believing that although it was a little sloppy, they were properly hunting goblins. Chris admitted that he had been wondering how the two of them hunted together, but now he understood. Hesta lured the goblins toward Ralph, who could not run, and Ralph finished them off. Satisfied with their teamwork, Chris agreed to form a party with them. Hesta was delighted. Ralph, still grumpy, questioned why they needed to form a party when they could already handle goblins on their own. Hesta remarked that he was acting like that again before angrily asking whether he truly wanted to spend his entire life as a rookie adventurer hunting nothing but goblins. Ralph claimed that he had only been joking. Hesta told Chris that she would be counting on him from then on. Chris replied that he would also be counting on both of them. He then said that he would head back first and that they could discuss the details that night. Hesta agreed and said she would see him later that evening. Ralph protested because they had just formed a party yet were not even going to hunt together. Back at the inn, Hesta announced their return, and Chris welcomed them back. Ralph showed Chris something, explaining that they had bought him some grilled skewers. Chris remarked that it seemed they had been thinking the same thing because he had also bought a variety of food. Ralph looked puzzled, and Chris explained that it was the day they had officially formed a party. Ralph muttered that they had not needed to buy anything, though he admitted that a few more skewers would not hurt. Chris revealed that what he had bought was not skewers. Ralph and Hesta were shocked. He had bought Saika Manju's pork buns, sashimi from Marura, and seasoned rice from Maruha Diner. Ralph exclaimed that they were all dishes from the famous restaurants they had always wanted to try, and Hesta was equally amazed. Ralph turned to Chris in excitement and asked whether they could really eat them as well. Chris replied that, of course, they could because they were a party now. Ralph and Hesta smiled at each other, and the three of them heartily enjoyed the meal together. After they finished eating, Chris asked what their goal would be from that point onward. Hesta and Ralph were confused. Chris added that rather than having a vague goal of simply adventuring together, he wanted to know whether they had a clear purpose. Ralph thought for a moment and suggested that making sure they always had plenty to eat was good enough. Chris pointed out that they were already eating well as things were. Hesta said that she wanted to become a mage and earn money, wondering whether it was acceptable since it was only a personal goal. Chris replied that a personal goal was perfectly fine. However, he asked whether she would leave the party once she became a mage and started making money. Hesta hesitated. She had no intention of leaving, but before she could finish explaining herself, Ralph admitted that he did not understand what Chris was getting at and asked him to say it plainly. Chris revealed that his own goal was to take revenge on his younger brother and, if possible, accomplish it while remaining a member of their party. Hesta asked what he meant. Ralph asked whether Chris intended to kill his younger brother. Chris confirmed that he did. Ralph was shocked and insisted that Chris should do it on his own. Chris replied that if he were capable of doing it alone, he would not be discussing it with them. Ralph hesitated, pointing out that the target was still Chris's younger brother. Chris's expression turned grim as he admitted that his younger brother was someone who stood on the verge of becoming the strongest person alive. Hesta asked whether there was a reason Chris wanted to kill his younger brother. That night, Chris explained everything to them. Ralph finally understood why Chris had fled into the forest. Chris added that if he had not tripped at that moment, he would have been killed. Every time he remembered it, he found it impossible to forgive Klaus. If Klaus ever found him, Chris was certain that Klaus would kill him without hesitation. Hesta understood why Chris wanted revenge, even against his own family. Ralph admitted that after hearing Chris's story, he understood the feeling. Even though his stepfather was already dead, Ralph had still wanted to kill him. Even so, he had no intention of helping Chris carry out his revenge. Chris replied that it was fine and that having them understand his situation was enough. Ralph suddenly recalled the poisonous dried grass Chris had kept the previous night and wondered whether it had been meant to kill his brother. Chris denied it, explaining that it had been for him to eat. He had never believed he could poison the sword god, and even if he could, he would not choose such a method. Ralph then asked what the dried grass actually was. Chris remarked that the timing was perfect because he had intended to tell them after they formed a party. He explained that it was a poisonous herb capable of drawing out hidden abilities, allowing the body to gradually grow stronger when consumed. Ralph questioned whether such a plant really existed because he had never heard of anything like it. Chris explained that only someone resistant to poison could have discovered it and that he was probably the only person who knew its true power. Ralph commented that it was actually quite amazing. Chris asked them once more what their goals were now. Hesta answered that, for the time being, she wanted to become a mage and be useful to both Ralph and Chris. She wondered whether that was enough. Chris replied that if she was satisfied with that goal, then it was enough. He then turned to Ralph. Ralph happily declared that he wanted to become the strongest adventurer acknowledged by everyone. Chris let out a scoff, saying that it sounded just like Ralph. Ralph was surprised, Hesta blushed, and Chris smiled. Ralph protested that Chris should not make fun of him. Chris explained that he was not mocking Ralph because Ralph's goal meant that Chris's goal would become the same. Ralph looked confused. Chris explained that his younger brother, Klaus, was regarded as a prodigy seen only once in several centuries. Although his name was not yet widely known, he would soon be celebrated as a heroic champion. Ralph remarked that despite hating his younger brother, Chris still acknowledged Klaus's abilities. He realized that if that were the case, his own goal would become surpassing Chris's younger brother as well. Hesta concluded that Chris sought revenge against his younger brother, Ralph wanted the strength to surpass Chris's brother, and she would help both of them achieve their goals. Chris declared that the ultimate goal of their party was to surpass Klaus the sword god, and asked whether anyone objected. Hesta and Ralph had no objections. Ralph was a holy knight who could barely walk properly. Hesta was a mage who could not use magic. Chris was a farmer immune to poison. Through this unusual connection, the weakest party was formed.